But leading our conversation today are Flower Darby, Director of Teaching for Student Success at Northern Arizona University, Vijay Sathi, Teaching Associate Professor in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and Ludi Goodson, co-author of Teaching at Its Best. I'm Carmen Makarashvili, Regional Director of Academic Programs at ACUE. I'm especially excited about this topic as it became the focus of my research several years ago as I worked with Notre Dame and Holy Cross College to create our first online programs. I truly appreciate the opportunity these experts bring us today and what their insights can add to our practices. In this webinar, we've been getting a lot of questions about synchronous and asynchronous discussions. We will be discussing both today, and for a definition of those terms, please look at the chat box. But today we're starting with Ludi Goodson to get us going on online discussion. Ludi?
Hello to everyone. Welcome to this webinar, and I hope you are well and have what you need at this time. I appreciate being with you and with the whole ACUE team. I want to start by telling you what I like about online discussions, which is how easy it is to see how your students are thinking and how shy students start to speak up and participate in the chance that you have to redirect any misconceptions. Now I want to just take a look at some basic discussion forums that are really easy to set up. And the first is an online office, and that would be on the next slide. Where students can post questions and the whole class sees the answers that you give. And the second is a student social hangout. Often that's called a lounge, but sometimes it has clever names from the instructors. A third is a getting to know you discussion where students answer the questions instructors give them to get to know each other better, but also then the instructor gets to know the students better. Another is a muddiest point forum, which is surprisingly successful. I give you the example of every week in an engineering course where students were just simply asked to tell what their difficulties were for the week, and they started describing them, problems they were having, and other students jumped in and started helping them out. And then the last type that we often add to a course, which is easy to add, is a study hall for students. Then there are some more complex kinds of discussions that are content focused, and we'll see that in the next slide. I'll give you a couple of asynchronous examples. One is in a sociology course where each week the instructor posted a controversial social topic, such as, is it okay to hook up? And what he did is he found two different YouTube videos that each expressed opposing points of view, and he asked the students to decide what's right and to give the reasons. In a rather different example, in a media legalities course, the students had 3 weeks to do research first. Then they entered a constructive controversy discussion session where, as teams, they presented opposing sides with logic and evidence. Now, in a synchronous example, the communications instructor treated it as a major project, and he had students use a couple of weeks to prepare, and they had a synchronous discussion every 3 weeks. And he set the date and the time for each of the meetings after he looked at their responses for what would be good times to meet. The sessions were recorded, and those who didn't participate could view the recording and they could complete an alternate essay assignment. But during this synchronous discussion session, students broke out into groups, and their challenge might be something like identify the ethical dilemmas in videos that the instructor had previously sent. And they would have to then explain why they were ethical dilemmas. Then at a designated time, the groups came back together, and a representative from each group would then explain their conclusions and their reasons. Now, whatever the strategy is, I think students do need some basic things, and that'll be on the next slide. The first is guidelines for communication. They may not know, after all, that all caps comes across as shouting or what comes across as harassment. Second thing that they need are directions, questions, and challenges. They need a clear purpose, timelines, and procedures to follow, and questions that lead them to decisions or to solutions. Of course, the directions will change with different topics, but some STEM faculty with whom I've worked use a SEAL reporting strategy. It's an adaptation of a writing strategy where students have to report C, the claim, E, evidence, A, their analysis, and L, their conclusion, which would be their last thought. Alan Jong at Florida State University does something similar. He has students to self-label every post that they have in a discussion area, and they label it as a challenge or an explanation or an argument or evidence. A third thing that students need is wait time and balanced facilitation. Instructors usually allow students the chance to respond on their own without jumping in, because, you know, if they jump in too soon or if they engage too much in a discussion, the students will actually discuss less. Of course, students do benefit from clarifications and from additional examples and resources, and, you know, the instructor can weave together themes that are coming across in the discussion. And then a fourth thing is the question of whether to grade or not grade the discussions. You know, some instructors I've worked with never give points. Most do give points, and most of them like to keep the scoring simple. So they might scan the discussions that students are engaged in. They'll give full points for effort. They won't penalize students who make a mistake or don't quite understand something. And then for those students who don't put forth any effort, they'll have a policy. The policy must be whether to deduct points or to give the students some second chances. But one of the things that I think is really important is at the first academic discussion that the instructor sends out a message to every student. So for those who are right on track with what they should be posting in the discussion, the instructor says, well, yes, you're on track and just keep doing what you're doing. And then for those who are not there yet, tell them how they need to improve. And then I would conclude that just as with any class, you know, what the students need and your method of teaching is what would really, should really be the driving force behind how you work with the online discussions.
Thank you, Ludi. A lot of practical information for everyone. Flower or Viji, do you have any response or additions?
There was so much in Ludi's very practical and helpful you know, mini presentation that it's hard to know exactly what to pick out, but I really like Ludi's focus on some of the low-hanging fruit kinds of discussion forums that you can add to your online classes that help students feel supported in terms of those muddiest point questions or online office or virtual study hall. I think there's a lot of potential there for students to be able to reach out and to support each other as well. And it doesn't take a lot of time or effort to add those elements.
Viji,
There you are. Hi. Yeah, sure. Can you hear me okay? Okay. I was going to add, I love the guidelines that were provided, you know, even the simple using all caps and how that is perceived. These are the sort of hidden curriculum aspects that we expect our students to know, but they don't always come in knowing that. So it's really helpful to unhide those aspects. And I love the idea of making that clear. And I would just say, I also really like the idea about the guidelines, because when we talk about inclusive teaching, we often think about the structure that's needed for students. And that's what you're doing when you communicate guidelines, is you're allowing people to understand what the guidelines are for discussion. And I'd say, you know, even using your students to help you co-create those guidelines, they've evidenced good and bad practices in discussion. So it's helpful to even crowdsource from them some of the things that they'd like to see happen in a course and work with them to really foster a good discussion.
thank you. And we do have a link to some Netiquette guidelines that talk a little bit more about those ideas around just little things like capital letters and how that can change the tone of a discussion. So we will post that in our resources. And now I would like to ask Viji to talk a little bit about STEM and synchronous discussion. Go ahead, please, Viji.
Sure. Is there a slide or no? Nope. Okay. There you go. Yeah, so I teach a quantitative course and we do a lot of problem solving in our course. And I know that a lot of my STEM colleagues use these kinds of opportunities in class for peer instruction where we have problems that students solve. I'm calling them micro discussions in the same way that we think about micro lectures. So we could punctuate our class with questions. And then oftentimes students will work with one another to solve a problem. And in fact, on this short break, I've been following a student group and they've been posting these bingo cards as memes of things that they're missing from their majors. And sure enough, in many of our STEM bingo cards is the turn and talk to your neighbor square, which just goes to show how frequently that technique is used in our classrooms to get students to talk to one another. And it's not, as we know from doing that in class in person, it's not enough to just say turn and talk to each other, because what ends up happening is they might say something as simple as, I got C, what did you get? I got C. And that's not a really rich discussion, right? So what we want to do is have very specific prompts like, please justify the answer you selected, or why are the other answers incorrect? And when you provide a very specific prompt like that each and every time, students actually go through that process of the reasoning that we want them to have, not just sharing the answer to questions. And so one of the things that I was thinking about when I transitioned online is how do I keep that semblance of the peer instruction in a synchronous format? I have sessions with students that I meet with them if they're able to, and then I post those videos later. And I allow for them to answer those poll questions as they would in the classroom and put them in breakout rooms to talk to one another about this justification for their answers. And I think it's important, no matter how you use synchronous time, that the students understand what the expectations are for the discussion. So those guidelines, as well as where they might report their answers. If it's a single person, how will you appoint the reporter in your group? So really providing a lot of structure around the timing and reporting elements as well, so that students are very clear about what they should be doing. They shouldn't get into their breakout rooms or wherever they are discussing to say, what did she say to do again? That you're really providing clear evidence and visuals around what their prompts are. And I have a piece that I co-authored with my colleague, Kelly Hogan, that came out last week in the Chronicle about how to use Zoom inclusively. And it has some tips in there as well for some of the synchronous activities. And in addition to the synchronous activities, I think it's helpful to leverage some of our asynchronous tools like a discussion forum. So I use a tool called Piazza, but there are many tools like it where students can pose and answer questions. One reason I gravitated towards this tool is because students can post anonymously, at least to themselves. They're anonymous, but to me, they are not. And this allows for, as Ludi mentioned, quiet students, but not just quiet students, but any student, like a student who might feel like their question was a simple question and they didn't want to pose it, or they don't want to appear dumb because they're asking something or they're answering it a certain way, or maybe they're feeling subconscious about things or they're not feeling confident about their abilities. This is a forum where students can post and answer questions, and instructors can simply just go in and like the responses that they're seeing from students, so endorsing their responses easily, building confidence in our students in asking and answering questions. These are really important things that help them understand that they have the potential not only to understand the material, but to formulate good questions and answers. And then also just thinking about the access to the questions. I think oftentimes when we don't do things in a discussion forum, what ends up happening is certain students might email us a question and we might then email back a response, but that response is not available to every student, right? And so I want to make sure that every student has access to all the questions and answers, and especially if it's something that would be valuable to them in an upcoming assignment or quiz to know about. So a discussion forum can be a way to sort of level the playing field about who has access to information, who feels comfortable answering questions and so on, or asking questions. And then lastly, just talk about when we teach, oftentimes in STEM courses, especially those introductory STEM courses, they're fairly large classes. We might have teaching assistants or undergraduate learning assistants or circulating around the room to help us facilitate discussions with students. And you can use technology to try to simulate some of those things in your online courses. So maybe if it's a synchronous session, maybe a TA or a ULA is assigned to the breakout room to help facilitate a discussion or float among a set of rooms that they could go in and peer into. But also they could be, maybe what you're doing is asking the groups to create a response, say in an online Google document. Maybe they could help monitor some of the discussion that's being posted on those Google documents for the groups. But not forgetting the fact that you might have support in the classroom, and making sure that you try as much as possible to incorporate them in the same ways that you might in a face-to-face course.
Some really helpful tips there from Viji. I'm going to go ahead and jump in and talk about a few logistical considerations, as Ludi directed our attention to asynchronous online discussions where people are not interacting real time. Viji was sharing some really helpful pointers about what happens if we are trying to lead a discussion over Zoom or something along that lines. But one thing that discussions online have in common is the need for a lot of structuring. And I really see the value of discussions in online classes. In fact, for me, that's where my best teaching takes place, because we can interact with our students in the moment. We can detect misconceptions, we can clarify, ask guiding questions. We can relate current events into how that relates to our class content. Now more than ever, there's a lot to be discussing with our students. And so I really see the value of online discussions. However, I think they don't just happen naturally. I think they take a little bit more intentional thought and effort to have them go off well. And so that's why I'm so excited about today's topic, both the planning and the facilitating of effective online discussions. So just a few logistical considerations to keep in mind as you're thinking about your discussion, whether it is not in real time or whether it's a group of students working together. First of all, and Ludi touched on this a little bit, really important to communicate clear expectations for your students. You don't want to leave them guessing about how they're supposed to engage in the discussion. So my expertise is in online asynchronous discussions where people can post on their own schedules and interact with each other. And I like to provide very clear guidelines. Sometimes it's a matter of your initial post should be at least 175 words and refer to one scholarly article. Very, very explicit details, depending on the purpose of your discussion. It may be the case that you have something more informal in mind, more of a conversation. And so you can help students understand that by saying, you don't need to provide a scholarly citation, but do support your work in your thoughts here. And so just helping students know exactly what you want them to do can really foster their success. I also think it's very important to schedule strategically, again, whether that's asynchronous or real time. For asynchronous discussions, you want to think about helping students to have a conversation. Students are busy people and they have a lot on their minds, again, especially right now. So they might be tempted to do what we call post and run. They might just submit their first discussion post and not really stay around in the conversation to engage with others and learn from the other students. In order to prevent this, a common strategy is to ask students to post an initial response and then come back within a few days and engage with other students by posting replies and responses and questions to what others have posted. So this helps hold students accountable to stay engaged in the conversation, and you can be really strategic. For example, you might say the initial post is due on Wednesday and the replies are due by Saturday, something along that line that gives people a little bit of time to engage in the conversation. You also want to think about your own scheduling and availability if you are grading your discussion forums. And there should be a due date that aligns with your ability to provide timely feedback. So if you know that you don't want to be in your online class on Sunday, I would recommend not making the due date Saturday night. You might make it Sunday night, and then students can, you can give feedback on Monday, just as one example. But speaking of giving feedback, it's really very helpful. Online students are working typically by themselves without the physical reassurance that they get from others in the classroom. And so all the support and guidance that we can give students is really, really important. In particular, I do like to grade forums, but I do like to keep it simple, similar to what Ludi suggested. For me, a really effective way to do that is to use rubrics or checklists. And in particular, I really have found a lot of success with using Linda Nilsson's specifications grading approach, which is, in a nutshell, and kind of an all or nothing. And Ludi touched on this too. Did did the students do what you wanted them to do, or did they submit junk effort? And then essentially they get the points either way. And when you use the rubric that is embedded in your learning management system, it actually allows you to really streamline your grading process so that you're not spending all day long doing that, and provide really rich and targeted feedback as well. So if you're not already familiar with the rubric tool in your learning management system, that might be something to consider. Now, again, although my expertise is not in the real-time synchronous discussions, I imagine that some of these principles will also apply there, and maybe Viji can speak to that as we go along throughout the hour. Thanks.
I'd like to add a few things. Certainly the importance of the scheduling strategy. I really appreciate what you said, Flower, about that. And certainly in the example of the communications course, that was really important when it's synchronous, to find out when students actually can meet and then schedule the
Yes.
session.
Yeah.
But it's really good, as you mentioned too, to have a consistent day for doing the different activities. I want to go back to something that Viji said earlier. She suggested that, she mentioned the name of the reporter, you know, having a reporter in the group. And so that brings up the whole idea as part of expectations of also having defined roles for students. And you can say, well, you're going to be the moderator, and you can have someone else be the reporter. You can have someone play the devil's advocate. But just decide what the roles are and let the students know what they are. And usually the instructors that I worked with rotate those roles across discussions. And then I wanted to mention also something that Viji said earlier. She said something about liking responses that students give. And that is something that I remember from an instructor who was in a location where she couldn't actually see what the students were posting, but she could see that they were posting. So what she did is she just clicked like, and the students loved it, you know, because they got feedback from the instructor.
Viji, do you have anything to add?
No, not at this time. I'm anxious to hear what questions come up for folks.
Okay, yeah, they're rolling in. I just want to thank you all, because not only do we have a lot of concrete practical examples here, but I love the way all of you touched on the real advantages to online learning. We can be inclusive in a way that perhaps we might not reach the students in our face-to-face classrooms. We can structure it for them in a way where everybody gets a voice. And we can encourage them to be thoughtful, especially when it's an asynchronous conversation. They can have that wait time to think about what their answer is and engage in different ways. So there's some wonderful examples and advantages that you all mentioned today. But the biggest question on the Q&A board, let's just go right there, is about engagement. There are a lot of questions about how do you make sure students are engaged? How do you make sure they're participating? How do you make sure they're posing quality questions and answers? So please speak to the engagement issue a little bit.
I don't know about everybody's course management system, but in the systems that I've worked with, there are several different ones. It's very easy to see what students are participating and when they are participating. And there's a way to be able to click so that all of the students' messages come up in a file, and then you can just see what they're doing, and you can highlight, you know, what's coming up in the discussion. What are the key concepts the students are hitting on? And the encouragement, though, part of it, like if you're in the discussion forum, I would say just acknowledge what someone has said. So maybe say something like, you mentioned the problem with, you know, whatever the issue is, can you give me an example of what you mean? So that is, just by asking another question is a really good way to encourage a deeper thinking and deeper discussion.
Yeah, I would like to add on just exactly to what Ludi was saying. For me, you can either police the engagement and sort of require it, or you can invite it and encourage it with actually interesting things to talk about. Students really engage sort of naturally when they're interested in the questions that you're asking. And so it might be the case that you really want to focus on discussable questions, things that have nuance, that have some controversy, that students can dig into. I like Ludi's point earlier about assigning a devil's advocate role. What's the other side of the story? You might also consider offering more than one question in a particular module or discussion forum, because that will allow students to kind of gravitate towards the one that they find most interesting. And I do have a trade secret. I think the kind of discussion question that invites the most natural engagement is when you ask students to write about themselves. And so we all like talking about ourselves and how our experience intersects with the concepts that we're working with. So if there's a way for you to ask the question to your students to say, where have you seen this before in your life? Or do you know anybody? Have you ever worked with someone? Have you ever had a class experience that? You know, and inviting students to bring the concept into their own lived experience will, I believe, foster more authentic engagement. And another benefit, it also promotes academic integrity in terms of it's really hard to Google an answer about your own experience with whatever that concept might be. So for me, to foster the engagement has a lot to do with the interest level of what we're asking students to do.
I'd like to piggyback on that, fostering the engagement, Flower. One of the other methods that instructors have used is, and I love this one, it was in a fashion design course. The instructor challenged the students to do a search on the web for their favorite design.
Right.
And she also provided students with 4 against which they would compare the one they had chosen. So they would post the link to what they found and give the reasons that they chose it, and then compare it to each of the 4 that she had provided.
Yeah, and I would add, just backing up a little bit, I think we're making the assumption they understand why engagement is important. And we should really be clear about why we expect engagement in our courses, what they stand to gain by the engagement. You know, I don't hide from my students that peer instruction is one of the most effective ways to learn in our course. And that's why we turn and talk to our neighbors often in class, because by teaching, we learn. And so they take turns teaching each other, and they then hopefully have some buy-in in this process, that it's not just about working towards the right answer, but it's about solidifying our own understanding about the concepts. And then also just the idea that, you know, that it's important to consider the ways in which all of our students can participate. So, you know, I use a polling technique in my classroom, like Poll Everywhere, where I have 100% of the students engaging in the answer to my question. And there's a common technique that some of us use when we use this. It's called a poll repoll, where a student would answer individually just on their own what their thoughts are to a question. And then I would look at the responses, and if they're not really where I would like to see them in terms of the percentage correct, I might say, okay, we can do better. Let's talk to one another about why we think that answer is correct. Let's see if we can improve our overall correct response rate. And then I can show them the pre and the post, right? Like that together we created something that was better than the individual. And I think, again, just reifying this message that there is more to be accomplished as a group than there can be individually. And in any ways that you can embody that and really just be transparent with your students about it, let's not leave it to chance that they'll just understand why we want what we want.
I'd love to comment just quickly on that. I think, again, in online classes especially, helping students understand the purpose of what we're asking them to do and the relevance. We can't be too transparent about that. Students need frequent messaging. And so I think in the discussion forums, or just as Viji was talking about there, you know, the ability to learn from each other and to learn as we teach a new concept ourselves really gets at our sociality and the way that our sociality drives our learning, which is a direct quote from Josh Eiler's book, How Humans Learn. You know, we really are social creatures, and students may not understand just how much they're able to learn from other students' input and examples. And so when we can message that and reinforce the value of how they'll be able to better understand content and maybe work more toward their own personal learning or academic or career goals, I think that does help students. Love the focus on helping students understand the relevance of what we're asking them to do. Great point.
And I want to emphasize that too with you, Flower, because that is such an important part of motivation. So that is another element of encouraging the students to be participating, you know, in meaningful ways in the discussion. And then that giving them feedback then helps to build their confidence too in the discussions. That's another key element in motivation. And hopefully then that leads them to also feeling really satisfied that the effort was worth it.
All really important points, especially right now as we're doing this. Somebody called it what, COVID transition, instead of when you're planning ahead for a course, it's one thing, but right now it's especially important to keep communicating. This is what we're doing. This is why we're doing it. This is why this method is important. So thank you so much. There is one question that's very specific that keeps coming up in the Q&A. Ludi, this is for you. A lot of people want to hear more details about the study hall forum that you mentioned.
That is so easy to set up. You can set it up so that it runs the whole semester, but most of the time instructors set up the study hall a couple of weeks before there's a major project that's going to be due or an exam. And then you can put in whatever directions are appropriate for the context. Basically set it up, call it a study hall, and then you can say, this is a place for you to review the stuff you've been studying, you know, that you're going to be, you know, quizzed on in 2 weeks, or you've got a major project coming up. This is an opportunity for you to share what you're working on, your progress with each other. And it doesn't really require monitoring. It's just a place for the students to study together.
Thank you. And then I have a couple of questions about inclusivity and access. They're a little bit different kinds of questions, but I think they hit at the wrong thing. And I think Viji touched on this a little bit in her presentation. Two things. What if students are having trouble with access with Wi-Fi or internet, but also what if they're shy or they're afraid of giving the wrong answer and having it be permanently in that asynchronous discussion or on that Zoom. So both things, what to do with these students who are not comfortable or able to participate as fully as they'd like in this online environment.
Viji, do you want to speak first to that? I have a comment, but I'd love to hear your thoughts first if you have some.
Sure. I think the access issue is definitely one that we all have to be thinking about very carefully, especially because this wasn't, we didn't all enter into this as a pre-agreed upon online learning experience. And so we're all doing this remote emergency instruction right now, and being mindful of the fact that our students and even some of our faculty weren't ready in some ways to be doing a lot of intensive online work this term. So I think it's different when you have more time to plan and people are entering into an online course and agreement. But in general, I'd say flexibility around how people can participate is very important. So for example, when I have the poll questions, I always make those poll questions available to my students who can't join synchronously so that they can also contribute their answers there. And I can keep monitoring how they're doing in the course based on their responses there. So always having an avenue for students to participate in the discussion and as many flexible ways as you feel you can offer is really helpful. And I don't think we should underscore just the ability to pick up the phone and talk to one another. We don't have to use fancy things, right? We can, I have a Google phone number that I give out to my students, and it just links up to my phone so they can contact me, and I give them some structure around, you know, if it's a certain time of the day, like I might not be able to pick up, but, you know, just give them some sense that like, it doesn't have to be complicated. You could just text message me if something comes up for you. So allowing for that flexibility, emailing things if they can't, if they're having trouble uploading, for example, or just letting you know that it might be late is helpful. And then the other aspect of this that you mentioned was sort of that, I guess the not wanting to be wrong. I think that especially in an asynchronous format where it's maybe documented and up forever, whereas in synchronous settings, we might forget. this is definitely something we all have to have in our wheelhouse, how to address when a wrong answer comes up or misconception comes up, how to gently nudge the person towards either reformulation of the question or, you know, one technique that I have in my back pocket at all times is to say something simple as, that is a great question. It's often a misconception for students. So let's unpack it a little bit and talk about why that misconception exists. So it's affirming the fact that that this is hard material and that there are going to be some things that are wrong, especially as a novice is navigating the material. So I think any things that you can use in your back pocket to really affirm the student, and maybe even contacting them afterwards to say, I really appreciated that you posed this question because it's one that many students struggle with, for example, can be a really good confidence boost for students.
Yeah,
Great.
you mentioned, oh, Vichy.
Go ahead, Ludi.
Sorry. Okay. The phone scheduling. Several of the instructors with whom I work do that. That's the first thing that they do. In fact, is they schedule a phone conversation with each of their students. So I just want to endorse that. It's worked really well for them. It doesn't take a whole lot of extra time. And then the reminder about flexibility. In the communications course, the instructor gave the students who couldn't come to the synchronous meeting the option to do the alternate essay assignment on the topic and view the recording for those who couldn't make it. And he's also someone amazingly who in a film course was able to work with a student who was blind and help that student be successful as well.
Yeah, sorry, I was just so excited to keep talking about this topic. Didn't mean to interrupt there, Ludi, but you know, again, I think as Viji reminded us, many of the students who are now doing remote learning didn't sign up for this. And even for people who had elected to take online courses either now or previously, circumstances are vastly different than they were just a few months ago. So I love that idea of offering the different options if they don't have access to technology, internet. You know, I'm working at home with my husband and my 3 school-age daughters, and we're all juggling access to Wi-Fi, and it's and we're in a really comfortable position to be able to have that. A lot of our students are juggling family schedules and the different kinds of demands as well. So love the idea of, you know, submit a different written assignment, email me what you can, give me a call, we'll talk it through. But I also did want to touch a little bit on inclusivity in online discussions. And again, Viji, you kind of touched on this. When a comment gets documented or archived in our online discussion forums, unfortunately, today, we need to kind of monitor what is happening in the discussions, because it may be the case that there might be some marginalization that happens. And again, it's archived. And so a student might make a comment directed at or about another peer in the course that might be very hurtful and harmful. And there's very interesting research that shows that the person who felt sort of harmed by that frequently goes back to that comment to see if anybody has responded or just to kind of revisit it over and over again. And so as instructors, I think it's really important not only to set the guidelines or to co-create the guidelines for collegial and respectful and civil engagement in these forums, but also to keep in mind that these comments and these remarks are in writing. And if a hot moment comes up in the classroom, kind of like Viji said, you know, you might just be able to sort of move on past it, but when it's documented, it's really important. And so if you were to find something like that, you might choose to delete it. You might save the comment in case you need to pursue something with your institution, but you might reach out to the person who was potentially harmed. You might address the issue with the person who made the post. Just being aware that in order to make everybody feel safe and welcome and able to engage in the conversation, you do sort of need to monitor what's happening in the discussion as well.
Mm-hmm.
That's so important. I'll give you an example of a student who was in a discussion area, and he was dominating and he came across as angry. Mm-hmm. And the instructor had tried private communication with the student, but that really wasn't changing the dynamics. And what the instructor finally did was just to look at the profiles of students in other groups and how they were discussing with each other, and just decided to move that student from the group he was in into another group, completely changed the dynamics. The student was happier in another group. The other group was happy with him. So it doesn't happen very often, but it is important to pay attention and then decide what to do.
Yeah.
I love this topic of inclusivity. When I taught students that were international, and I'm sure many of you are dealing with this situation where they're in different time zones. They might not be as comfortable with English. And I would offer them the opportunity to talk to each other on the phone, or if they were near each other, they could talk however they wanted to and answer the discussion question. And then one person would just have to post a summary or a recording of what they spoke about. It gave, especially the people who didn't feel comfortable writing in English, it helped them a lot to be able to post a voice thread or a different way of posting to include them as well, and time zones as well. So lots of great information here. There are lots of questions about assessment and how I'm thinking, Flower, you mentioned the rubrics. Maybe you want to elaborate a little bit about how do you assess discussions?
Sure. Yeah, so thanks, Carmen. I think it's very important to think about what your goal for the discussion is, and that will shape your assessment approach. So again, giving the clear expectations of exactly what students should do will also make it easier for you to assess their submissions. For me, if you have a very clearly defined set of criteria, what they should be doing, and then you align that with your rubric so that the rubric reflects what it was that you told your students that they should be doing, then the assessment piece isn't so overwhelming or daunting. A very common scenario is to require students to post at least 2 or 3 times, one original and maybe a response to a couple of other students. And again, of course, I am talking about asynchronous, but you might have something to add about synchronous. But you want to give the guidance to students, for example, in their responses. It's not real helpful if a student replies to another student and says, I agree. That's not a great contribution. And so you want to provide that guidance to students to help them understand that they need to add something, provide substantive contribution, or ask some questions, or maybe refer to another source or an angle of the argument. And then for me, again, when I've used that sort of all or nothing specs grading rubric, it's just a matter of skimming over students' contributions and saying, were they engaged? Were they making that effort? If so, they get all the points. If not, maybe they didn't get points on this discussion forum. But I have to add that in the specs grading approach, you can also offer students OOPS tokens where they can resubmit their work. It is certainly possible to assess on more of a traditional grading scale with A, B, C, D kinds of levels of performance, and that might be helpful for your discipline or your content. For me, it's more about the conversation in the classes that I've taught, and so if they're engaging in the conversation, I give them full points for that. I hope that helps, but I'm happy to see what Viji and Ludi also have to add.
I would like to add that the communications course instructor treated the discussions as a major assignment. So he did what you suggested. He had a rubric aligned with the criteria, and the students would have that information before the discussion so they knew what the expectations were, and then it was graded as a major assignment. But in the discussions, in the example I gave of the sociology course, where there was a weekly discussion and students had to say, okay, which side is right, and why do I think one side or the other is right? The instructor did not give A, B, C, D, or E or score points, but just did what you also suggested, Flower, which is let's scan and let's see if there's genuine effort to answer the question, then just give full points. But you do give points. Most instructors still give some points because students will do it for points, even if it's only 2,
Yeah, that's the currency that they work with. So it's nice to use it. And I think I like the approach as an assessment person. I like the approach of the sort of specs, like all or none. It makes it so easy to grade. And it really is it's just about doing the work and there are other ways to provide really good feedback to your students about the quality of work that they're producing. So for example, I don't grade their Piazza contributions, but I look from time to time, I get some diagnostics out of the tool that tells tell me who are the top contributors to the site, who's asking the most questions, who's answering the most questions. And I reach out to them individually and I say, you're doing a stellar job on the site. And at the end of the semester, I might say, could I invite you to be an undergraduate learning assistant in this course? Because I think you would be a great asset to sort of helping students understand the material. And this is how some of my students who never imagined that they could do anything quantitative start to realize, but I like teaching and I like the idea of helping my peers understand the material. So it's another way to create a sense of belonging in a course that they might not have expected that they would do well in. So I think there's a lot of reasons to give great positive feedback to students who are doing it well, and still manage the grading aspects so that it's not a burden to you to monitor.
I'll just add quickly that for me, discussion forums in general, and then written reflections or written responses or recorded, you can invite students to use their smartphone to video or audio record their responses. For me, that helps students to really think through and articulate their thinking and their response. However, we do hear from a lot of instructors that adds a lot of a grading burden, where if they just provide auto-graded multiple choice quizzes as an example, it saves them a lot of time. But that's what I really like about that specs grading approach, is that you are inviting students to do the critical reflection and the creative problem solving that is so important for tomorrow's citizens, without burdening yourself so much with the grading work.
Yeah, and I'll add one more thing, is that I wouldn't underestimate their ability to evaluate themselves on that task. So giving a self-evaluation of their contribution to discussions, as well as maybe if they've got a small group, how their peers are doing in their discussion. I find when I ask students to reflect on that they map pretty well to my impressions as well. So it's a really great tool to sort of think about one's own presence in a discussion.
Great point. And not for emergency learning so much, emergency online, but maybe for planning ahead, like I know many of you are doing, asking them to help develop the rubric around what does make a good discussion. And then it's on the students and they feel like they have ownership of that. So that's just another thing on that we can talk about. But there is a very, very specific question for Viji. A lot of people would like to know more about your bingo cards. Could you talk about that, please?
They're not my bingo cards, just to be clear.
Well, what you described, yes.
Yes. So the students are circulating, basically, it's like a bingo card you would imagine, I think like maybe a 4x4 or 5x5 grid. And then in each square, they put something that they expect some students have had some interaction with in that major. So sometimes they might list a popular phrase like turn and talk to your neighbor, or they might talk about like, so in biology, they have what are called GRQs, or guided reading questions, before every class session. And so they have a comment about if you've answered your GRQs for today, for example. So each square just represents something that might be a pretty common experience for students, and they have fun kind of thinking through, can I get bingo by marking through some of those. So I've had fun sort of peeking in on other majors and seeing what kinds of themes our students are pulling out as experiences that they see in that community.
Thank you. There are a lot more questions coming in, and we will have a chance to expand the conversation in the discussion, but I'd like to know, all of you have so much to share. Could you each share a takeaway or a main point as we are nearing the end of our conversation?
I would, okay. Shall I go or not?
Go ahead.
The main takeaway is just for me, be unafraid of setting up a discussion. If time is short, do something really simple, like have a muddiest point forum, maybe have a study hall, and if you can't do anything else. But for major discussions, simply be clear about the expectations and try to think through what you really want the student to do and the order in which to do it. Mm-hmm. And what I think would be good is to remember to ask those what, how, and why questions.
Nicely said. I'll jump in, and Carmen, I feel like you kind of caught us off guard a little bit because I feel like we put some of our main takeaways in our first presentations, but it's a good opportunity to sort of wrap up and reflect. For me, it really is about the value of interacting with our students as people. Right now, in this moment, many people are really missing that physical interaction and the energy that we get from working together in the same room. But I would strongly argue that you can recapture that in your online discussion forums. And so again, this circumstance is not ideal, but as you move forward with your exploration of online teaching practice, I really encourage folks to be in there with the discussion forum. As Ludi said, you have to be careful not to dominate, but for me, it's really about responding to students, and the more that you give of your own time and energy in that context, the more your students will give back to you.
Yeah, these are great. Yeah, I was caught off guard too. I think what I would say is to really be thinking about transparency with your students around why you're doing what you're doing, and not assuming that they understand what role discussion has in your course. And I think using technology wisely, as well as thinking about your own time to manage that discussion, is really important. As I would advise any faculty member, if you're trying something new for the first time, make it low stakes, make it no stakes if you want to, just so you don't add that extra burden of having to be accountable to students about something. And it does ratchet up the stress level for everybody if it's higher stakes. So really just trying to dabble in things that are no or low stakes is a really easy way to get that across. And I think just communicating with one another, really talking to colleagues and seeing what they're doing and experimenting with. I mean, there's no reason we need to invent everything. We can just learn from one another what's worked and what's not. And I guess I would say the main thing to think about is, even as seasoned instructors, either face-to-face or online, we're going to have days where it doesn't feel like it's going well, where it doesn't feel like the discussion is moving, or that students or yourself are feeling low energy, and try not to let that derail you, and just think of it as one bad experience or one not so positive experience, and try to move on from that. But I think it is very difficult right now, especially to be thinking about how will this work online. If you're having one or two of those bad days, try not to extrapolate and make it something that you think might be a pattern in the future.
Thank you. I feel like I could talk to all of you for another hour, but we're running short on time now. Really great information. Again, there will be more opportunities to continue the conversation online in our webinars discussion page. We will provide you all with the recording and the transcript of today's conversation. And you can add your thoughts for the attendees to the conversation that has just started today. Again, I think there was a lot of conversation that just got started, and we will continue.